Let's talk about putting an army of Adeptus Astartes on the tabletop with an overview of collecting Space Marines in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of collecting the faction from a standing start. Let's talk through a bunch of reasons why you might want to collect Space Marines in Warhammer 40k, a few things to think about when planning an army out, some thoughts and options for first purchases to establish the core of the army and then expand beyond there, and then finish up with a quick look through the Space Marine rules and detachments and one example army list. Absolutely loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect Space Marines in Warhammer 40k? I feel like for a lot of people, they're perhaps the first faction that people get to know in the setting. Pretty much the poster boys of the game, bigger augmented superhumans in power armour, basically the finest of humanity trying to hold the tide against an entire galaxy of horrors. Space Marines are absolutely integral to the entire 40k story, setting out as 20 legions in the Great Crusade, brother turning upon brother in the Horus Heresy, and then since then they've broadly been organised into nightly monastic chapters, each self-sustaining and fighting in its own little dominion, and the standard Space Marine chapter is quite a nice canvas for expressing their own themes and styling, each one having their own theming and fighting style, and also flaws. There's chapters of crusading space knights, relic hunters of mysterious origins, and marines that prefer tactical stealth and guile to bright heraldry. Being so ubiquitous and powerful to the setting, often when the Imperium is fighting, the Space Marines tend to be at the forefront of the fray. Most of the biggest 40k lore events take place around them, and when they make war they do so with a vast array of different tactics and war gear, perhaps the most iconic weapons being bolters, chainswords, and fancy power weapons in close combat, but can fight in all manner of different styles, whether it's infantry firebases, arrow-swift bite formations, tank and mechanised forces, or phalanxes of stomping dreadnought sarcophagi. With so much to draw on, basically none of the factions in Warhammer 40k have quite such a well-developed lore and backstory as the Space Marines. For their model range to go hand in hand with their lore, they're very much the biggest and best supported miniature range in Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop have had a bit of chicken and egg situation with them. There's loads of Space Marine players, so Games Workshop tends to make more Space Marine models as they know they'll sell well, and that turns them into an even better supported range, so more people are tempted to try them out. As a result, they've got loads and loads of options to put on the tabletop. As mentioned, they can make armies that are very different to each other, and the majority of their things have now been redone in the more modern Primaris era over the last 7 years or so. Essentially, Games Workshop's upscale and remake of the Firstborn range to the newer, bigger and chunkier Primaris that you can see here. 10th edition does feel like when this has sort of come to a head. Now the majority of their options are Primaris Marines, and the last few Firstborn Marines are a bit of a minority within their codex, so it does mean that their range is slightly awkwardly split over between things that have been recently updated, and still quite a large chunk of models that might be updated or phased out in not too very long. The Primaris miniatures I think are generally kind of well received, though some certainly far more so than others. The recent 10th edition ones seem to have gone down okay for the most part, particularly the new resculpt of the standard Space Marine Terminator that you can see here, the classic Space Marine Armoured Elite in tactical dreadnought armour. For a few examples of miniatures in their range, here on the left we have a standard Space Marine Intercessor, in the Primaris era basically your standard guy with a bolter on the battle line, well known for their flexibility, both on the attack and the defensive. On the right there's a Space Marine Outrider, equipped with chainswords and hurtling towards the enemy at breakneck speed on sturdy bikes. And at the front here we have Rabute Gilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, marshalling the forces against the myriad horrors that try and overwhelm them, from Tyranids to Necrons to Chaos. For a few more tasters of their range, on the top left here's a Gladiator Lancer tank. The Primaris vehicles have often been redone with sort of hover grav plates, maybe some like the aesthetic a little bit more than others perhaps. On the bottom left we've got a Space Marine Infiltrator, a slightly sneakier forward operative in fast moving Phobos armour. At the top we have a Sinister Skull Mask and black robed chaplain, responsible for morale and prosecuting the enemy's justice with righteous zeal. And on the bottom right we have a dual pistol wielding Inceptor, a great big Gravis armour marine, dropping down from the heavens and dealing out bolt fire at close range. Most of the previous were Primaris Marines, and here are a few examples of the Firstborn. On the left we have the more standard Tactical Squad, a staple of the tabletop for years and decades now. On the bottom right we have a Devastator Squad blasting away with heavy weapons, and on the top right we have a Whirlwind tank, providing some rugged and mobile artillery fire for the chapter. I'll talk about them a little bit more later, but it seems there's a good chance that most of these will either get updates or are tied to Legends within the next few years or so, with Games Workshop trying to complete the release of their Primaris range. Generally, one positive of collecting Space Marines tends to be the pricing, at least compared with a few of the other 40k offerings out there. Though I would caveat that with it being very different depending on exactly how you go about collecting Space Marines. In general, in 40k, more elite armies that need fewer models on the table don't tend to be quite as expensive as some of the others. And Space Marines in particular, kind of being the poster boy faction with a whole bunch of divergent chapters, often do really quite well for discount deals. Lots of ways to get your hands on kits that are a bit cheaper than Games Workshop's normal prices. If you go heavy on the starter sets, Combat Patrol box sets, and maybe make use of Hachette Partworks magazines when they make sense, all of that could be handy enough, though bear in mind that they are an army that you could basically keep on expanding endlessly if you really wanted to. Trying to have every single unit that the Space Marines have to offer in good numbers is probably going to be a slightly losing battle, given how many they release, and chasing the meta for in-game power can get particularly expensive for them, maybe more so than other factions perhaps. Finally for Space Marines, let's mention gameplay. Their current rules are in Codex Space Marines, and that's where you'd find all the ones for collecting the more standard chapters, outside of things like Blood Angels, Dark Angels, and the other divergent ones. With the playstyle for Space Marines, they tend to be fairly aggressive and at least relatively forgiving mechanic-wise. All their units have at least okay armour with their 3+ armour saves and alright melee stats. That means even a lot of their, say, heavy weapon Space Marines could still manage to bully a light infantry squad of the enemy army in a pinch. With all their unit choices, there's a good balance of both ranged and melee options that can both work well if you want to. Optimised army lists tend to have a balance of both in 10th edition, but you definitely can make full melee or full ranged marines work to some extent. Their core rule plays into aggression and damage dealing, with Oath of Moment giving you big damage against one key target per turn. And they've got 7 detachments that can really skew the theme of how you play the army. Say Vanguard Spearhead for some sneaky infiltrating tricks, Gladius Task Force for some tactical balance and big firepower, or Ironstorm Spearhead supporting tank and dreadnought armies. For their current in-game power, unfortunately the core Codex Marines are doing fairly badly by the tournament stats. At around about 42% wins, they could be argued to be one of the weaker factions in the game, and in particular seem to be overshadowed by the divergent chapters like Dark Angels and Blood Angels, which kind of get all the things that they do, but also more options for detachments and units. While this is maybe something to note, I feel like it's not really something to get too hung up about. Army power in Warhammer 40k is changing literally all the time. Games Workshop do quarterly balance updates, and any one of those could catapult Space Marines all the way back to the top. It's generally considered best just to collect the army that you enjoy and stick with it, and just roll with the times. In any case, Space Marines are an incredibly popular faction to play, a cool army of superhuman, power-armoured Imperial elites, and often the reason that people get interested in collecting 40k in the first place, and generally tend to be at least fairly forgiving for a new player's army. If you do decide to collect an army of Adeptus Astartes, there's certainly loads of places that can allow you to do a bit of research or get more of a feel for the faction on the tabletop before you start. Codex Space Marines itself definitely isn't the worst place. Lots of nice pictures of the various different units, a bunch of lore, and the current unit profiles. There's plenty of other places to access 40k rules out there, Battlescribe and Warhapedia, New Recruit and Games Workshop's app. If you do have the Codex, any of those can be used to put some army lists together and have a rough idea as to how a Space Marine force might fit together on the tabletop. If you wanted to try before you buy, you can always proxy some models in a game and see how you like the feel of the faction, or maybe use Tabletop Simulator online if that's your thing. And here on YouTube there's just an enormous amount of videos that are Space Marine relevant. On this channel I've made a Space Marine tier list that could be interesting enough for getting a handle on a bunch of units. I'll leave that links down in the video description, and beyond that lots of things talking about detachments and individual unit reviews, so feel free to check those out. There's loads more on other channels though, battle reports to see the Astartes in action, painting guides for a bit of inspiration as to different ways that you could get that power armor looking nice, and of course just a ridiculous amount of lore videos about any given Space Marine army and chapter that you might want to collect. It could be worth following along on social media as well, Discords, Facebook pages and subreddits. The Space Marines have examples for all of those, and there's plenty for specific chapters as well. Can just be interesting to join one or more of those and just imbibe a little bit about what people are talking about for the army, and it can be a way to ask some basic questions to more experienced players as well. Perhaps one of the single biggest choices to make when you're planning an army is what chapter you're going to collect. There's quite a lot of options with this. Either you can just make up one of your own with your own colour scheme, maybe decide that they're going to be successors of one of the main legions in the lore, or leave their origin a mystery, which is kind of common. Or you can go with one of the established chapters, maybe one of the particularly storied ones that get featured heavily in the Codex, or a minor background one from the lore where there's some information but they don't tend to be front and centre. Out of the most major and well-known ones, these are the ones that tend to be a bit less divergent and more core codex compliant, generally not having their own units and greatly altered options, besides maybe a few named characters and heroes. Here we have the tactically balanced and sort of Romanesque themed Ultramarines, the mighty Salamanders fighting with their relic weapons and a lot of Melter and Flamer to blast the opponent apart at close range, the vicious and fast-moving White Scars, often liking to do arrow-swift attacks on bikes, the dour and methodical Iron Hands, believing the flesh is weak and enjoying blasting the opponent apart with heavy tanks and dreadnoughts, the stalwart Imperial Fists, siege and defense specialists, having a good liking for their bolter drill and heavy weapons to bring down the enemy's tanks and bunkers, and the sneaky and stealthy Raven Guard, liking nothing more to strike from the shadows with a jump pack. Their guile and subterfuge, combined with the raw might of Astartes, can be a very effective force in battle. Currently in 10th edition, these guys do have some themed rules as per different detachments, but each of those detachments is sort of worded in a generic kind of way. While you can tell there's one that's clearly aimed to be Ultramarines and one that's aimed to be Salamanders, there's nothing to stop any one of these chapters using any one of the detachments, and I think it's kind of nice that rules aren't locked to paint quite so much, and you still have the option to absolutely go for the chapter's most lore-friendly detachment if you want to. Beyond that, on top of those, there's also the more divergent Space Marine chapters, each of which have a lot of their own units and will get codexes of their own in 10th edition. They arguably operate a little bit closer to being factions in their own right, and tend to collect armies that have a lot of theme and flavour towards their different tropes, and collecting them are all worthy of their own videos, which I have made one of them for each so far besides Deathwatch. They're a slightly unusual case, now they've been rolled into Codex Imperial Agents. Finally, as mentioned, you can collect a successor chapter of some sort. Here are the Blood Ravens, famous from Dawn of War, or the Crimson Fists under Pedro Cantor, famous for their defense of Rin's world. Coming up with your own chapter maybe does have some advantages in being able to maybe jump between rule sets a bit if you want to. Plus it can be nice to bring some custom lore and theme if you'd like. There's quite a lot of different ways in which you can collect Space Marines. When planning an army, I'd say sometime early in the process, it's worth planning out a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list, just to give you some sort of general idea as to where your force might be heading, even if that might change and update as you get more games in, or you learn more about how your army works and what you like and don't. All sorts of ways in which you can decide to try and build that army. Are you just going to go for something that's effective in game, with a good mix of damage dealers, battle line units, and things to rush around doing secondary objectives? Are you going to theme it to one of the chapters and their iconic units, maybe using loads of Bolter Marines for Imperial Fist for example, or some nice Melter and Flamer armoured units for Salamanders? Or are you going to construct a Space Marine list of a certain type that you want to try and make work, perhaps going for an entire phalanx of Dreadnoughts with some support, or a force that goes very heavy in Veterans and Terminators? A lot of players like to build around one certain detachment from the Codex as well. The rules generally mean that certain units are really quite favoured in one detachment more so than another. So say you could set your sights on the Gladius Task Force for example, and try and take a bunch of units that will be most effective with the combat doctrines that that one offers you. With all the talk of chapters and paint as well, it's worth painting up a test model at the same time. I start with something relatively basic and representative of the army. Likely the best choices are a standard intercessor, assault intercessor, or maybe an Infernus Marine, given that they're quite easy to get your hands on these days. Always better to start with one model that's going to be a bit more low investment before just launching into painting your fanciest HQ or biggest tank, as it means that you could change things if you decide that you don't like the way that it's come out, or even if you want to go for a completely different colour scheme. Space Marines and their power armour have a lot of different ways that you can go about painting them. You absolutely can get great results with things like careful application of dry brushes, maybe going contrast paints if you want a quick and effective solution, though I'd say that their big flat armour panels don't do as well with them as some armies out there. And you can get a bunch more inspiration from watching some talented folks on YouTube paint their Space Marine in all manner of different ways. If you do try and copy the box art with the hard edge highlighting methods that Games Workshop often tend to favour, bear in mind that that does take a fair bit of time. That is the route that I went for my own Space Marine chapter, and while I do like the way that they came out, it does mean that I paint Space Marines incredibly slowly. Moving on though, let's talk about actually picking up some miniatures. In general, when starting out a Warhammer 40k army, I'd generally either start with, say, just a standard infantry kit, like one of the ones that we just mentioned, to test out some colour schemes on, or either that or a discount box to get really quite a lot of models in one place. Often the focus when you're just starting out is to get quite a lot of models on the table fairly quickly so you can actually build up to playing games, and then maybe move on after that to add a little bit more theme or gameplay threat, expanding the army with units that you think are going to take you gradually towards the sort of army you want to wind up at. As mentioned, for an infantry kit, something like the Intercessors, Assault Intercessors, or Infernus Marines could be okay. Both flavours of Intercessors are nice to have some standard guys to hold objectives. It generally tends to be at least kind of relevant for most Games Workshop rule sets that they've had for them. And if you're getting Infernus Marines, I'd take a look second hand on places like eBay. They tend to go at much lower rates than Games Workshop sell a standard box for them. In general, for Space Marines, I'd usually rate their 10 model kits as to be relatively good value relative to the rest of 40k. At least compared with some of their 3 model elites, I feel like you get a lot more plastic and miniature points value on the tabletop than most of them. I think I'd generally aim for that sort of thing if you just wanted to dip a toe in the faction and maybe get some test models painted up, and otherwise if you're sure that you're collecting Space Marines and know roughly what you're doing, I'd probably choose one of the discount kits, of which Space Marines have really quite a lot of options that we'll go through now. First up, and the most obvious choice, is Combat Patrol Space Marines. The Combat Patrol box sets are Games Workshop's standard discount offerings, where it's a big box where you get a lot of kits included, but they come at a slightly lower price than if you bought them separately. But basically no one should ever get the standard Combat Patrol Space Marines, as you can directly get these exact same miniatures for cheaper in a couple of different ways. The models themselves are nice enough for someone starting out though. Terminators get a bunch of points on the board, and you get a couple of characters, though I must admit versus most of the other Combat Patrol box sets out there, you'd get very little plastic if you did pay the full £100 or $168 for this one, and I'd absolutely certainly look to try and pick these up via the starter sets if you wanted them. Basically, if you wanted the miniatures from Combat Patrol Space Marines, the easiest way to get them as new miniatures from Games Workshop or discount retailers is to go for the standard 40k starter set. That's the one that's pictured, that's a bit more miniature focused, and currently that one's £67.50 or $112 from GW. That gets you all the Combat Patrol contents minus the Tyranids, even if you were literally just going to pick that entire set off and bin the Tyranids off, which you probably won't do. It'll still be far cheaper than buying the Space Marines mentioned previously, actually via the Combat Patrol box set, and in reality, if possible, if you can find a Tyranid player to split the set 50-50 with, it's one of the best deals that Games Workshop does for Space Marines right now, around about £35 or $55 or so for 5 Terminators, a Captain and an Infernus Marine squad. There's also the option of the Ultimate Starter set as well, which adds in a small core rules book plus some terrain. That's quite a lot more expensive though, so it isn't quite as miniature focused unless you're really wanting the terrain and the rule book and things. That one does come with the Terminator Librarian included if you wanted him though. And of course, if you can happen to find a Space Marine half of the Leviathan box being sold online, then that's also pretty well worth it. When this came out for the 10th edition launch box, it was £150, €200 or $250. Containing these Space Marines here, so basically an expanded version of the Combat Patrol, notably with a big chunky Ballistus Dreadnought and some Stern Guard veterans and more characters, plus loads of Tyranids as well. Most places now tend to have sold out of these. You might be able to find occasional copies at some brick and mortar Games Workshop stores, or maybe some smaller discount retailers that don't have an online presence, but otherwise could be worth checking out people selling box halves on eBay or other second-hand selling platforms. In general, the price of this has been creeping up though as supply gets more and more limited. I personally say that if you can find this for somewhere around the £100 or $150 mark or less, it's well worth jumping on. Basically getting far more Space Marines than you get from a standard Combat Patrol for about that same sort of price. When talking about picking up Warhammer 40k miniatures, it's usually worth just mentioning the different options available, and particularly underlining that Games Workshop stores and the Warhammer website are the most expensive way to buy their products. Ordering direct might be the single most reliable way, but the majority of people tend to buy new Warhammer miniatures from local gaming stores or online discount retailers. Official stock is selling the same models, but at around about a 10 to 20% discount depending on where you are in the world. As ever, I've got a bunch of examples of those links down in the video description. Element Games for 15% off in the UK, Gap Gamers for 21% off for Australia and New Zealand, Fenris Workshop for 10% off in Canada, Wargame Portal for 15% in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep for 16% in the EU. Those ones are affiliate links that do help to support the channel, so a big thank you to anyone using those. I certainly use discount retailers to buy new Warhammer when I do pick some up though. It does save a lot over the long term versus GW. New shiny plastic models very much aren't the only option though. Particularly for Space Marines, check out the second-hand market. With an enormous player base, you find people selling armies really quite regularly, or individual units they might have not wanted from discount deals or all sorts of things. eBay can certainly be worth a look if you're looking to pick up any one miniature, and it can save you both a bit of money and potentially time putting them together. And you can also keep an eye out on any of the other places where people might buy and sell things around you: Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, potentially forums and things, all with their own pros and cons. Another big thing these days is 3D printed miniatures and third-party manufacturers. Lots of great alternative sculpts exist out there, and with Space Marines being quite so popular, lots of people are happy to make their own versions of slight alternative proxy models, things that won't look exactly the same as the Games Workshop things, but do well enough to represent Space Knights and big chunky power armour. In particular for Space Marines, they can be a really handy choice for getting aesthetic upgrades on the go. Maybe getting some custom shoulder pads that fit the theme of your chapter a lot better than what Games Workshop offer, or maybe some custom weapons or shields or backpacks that greater fit in with the theme of the chapter. Otherwise though, let's talk through a few other discount deals for getting started with Space Marines, alternatives to the Space Marine starter sets and Leviathan models. I say one reasonable one to consider could be Combat Patrol Dark Angels, £100 or $168 for the miniatures here. Combat Patrols tend to be kind of lighter infantry focused these days, but at least this one gets you a few damage dealers in the Blade Guard and the Hellblasters, plus a good contingent of troops. The only maybe slightly weird thing for this one for general Space Marine collectors is the Gravis Captain, with no unit to lead in this box, so you might want to pick up some aggressors to go alongside. The discount isn't enormous at 20%. It's maybe a shame not to have a big chunky focal model, but it still could be handy enough for wanting to get a bunch of power armor on the table a little bit cheaper. The Space Wolves one could be another option. Bear in mind that the Battle Leader is a bit more Space Wolf themed for this one, but otherwise it's 5 Reavers, an Invicta Warsuit and 10 Intercessors. I must admit, probably not the best balance of units for in-game strength right now, but if you like your Phobos Marines and Scouty stuff, could be handy enough. And otherwise there's a direct-only Games Workshop deal, this one called the Vanguard Task Force. This one is a monopose kit based around the Phobos Space Marines, and in this one there's 10 Infiltrators, 3 Eliminators with the Bolt Sniper Rifles, and 3 Suppressors for the jump guys with the autocannons, plus a Phobos Lieutenant. Again, compared with what these would cost separately, these ones can be a pretty reasonable option to get lots of power armor on the table for a little bit cheaper than Games Workshop might normally charge. The discount deals tend to be a little bit more limited on this one around the world, though plenty of discount shops still have them, such as Wargame Portal in the USA. They're one of Games Workshop's online-only offerings. Otherwise, with Space Marines having quite so many releases, there's quite a lot of past discount sets that you might be able to look out for. Things like the Blood Angels previous Combat Patrol was an interesting one for just a general purpose start collecting Space Marines box set. I quite like this one with some aggressors, sneaky Phobos, basic troops and a transport. You might find them crop up second hand from time to time. Last year's Christmas box set was a Spearhead Force. If you want loads of jump intercessors, plus a few biker type units, then that could be handy. And the previous Combat Patrol Dark Angels was an interesting one, 3 Inceptors, a big chunky Redemptor Dreadnought, a Captain and some Intercessors. Again, it's alright value if you can find it at some semblance of the original price. For collecting and expanding Space Marines in general, there's a few other things to bear in mind. I certainly wouldn't write off the possibility of kit bashing models, plenty of options for small value savings there. Particularly with Warhammer miniatures, character miniatures are charged at a massive premium versus standard infantry models, so if you can ever do a cool conversion to transform a standard infantry model into a character miniature, then you might save yourself a fair bit of money there. Lots of things can look the part really quite well, particularly if you've got some robes and things on the go. The Blade Guard Veterans could be an interesting base for character style miniatures, or maybe the Black Templar Sword Brethren. Could be nice to make yourself some fun custom lieutenants, or Space Marine captains maybe. While a bunch of Space Marines are a little bit more mono-purpose with their different weapons now, you still might be able to turn some cheaper squads into some more expensive ones. Say for example using Assault Intercessors to make into Blade Guard or Jump Intercessors as a couple of examples. The Blade Guard kit comes with lots of additional power swords and shields that you could use to kit bash a few more of them. And if you could get your hands on some jump packs, maybe from a kit like the Vanguard Veterans or Blood Angels Death Company, or maybe some sort of third-party 3D printing company that sells some, you could basically upgrade them into some jump intercessors really quite easily. For the cheapest standard Space Marine body that you can get, the Infernus Marines might be another good option in 10th edition. Some of them might need a bit more work and a few more parts to transform them into something else, but they're likely to be the cheapest Tacticus armoured body that you can buy at the moment, due to featuring in Leviathan and the starter set. For other value saving things that might be of use to some people, I'd keep an eye on the Hachette Partworks magazines. These are currently coming out in a run in the UK at the moment. We've had the first issue, but looks like it could be another good way to get your hands on a bunch of other Space Marine stuff, particularly out of the starter sets. The first one was essentially a Terminator Captain for £3, which is crazily undervalued for Games Workshop's characters. and then most issues after that will be £10 or local equivalent, so it could be interesting for things like the Space Marine Terminators, maybe the Terminator Librarian or Chaplain on Bike. This will likely be coming out in the USA in spring 2025 and should come to a bunch of other locations around the world that year as well. Finally, for discount things, for a slightly more out there option, a very different way to collect Space Marines could be to go for a Heresy era aesthetic and try and make it applicable to 40k. The Heresy starter box in the Age of Darkness gets you a massive amount of plastic on the table, 40 guys with bolters, 10 Terminators, a Dreadnought and a massive Spartan tank. Pretty much all of that can be press ganged into 40k service if you want to. Use the bolter guys as intercessors, the Terminators as regular Terminators, use the Spartan either with Legends rules or take off a set of las cannons and run it as a Land Raider, and run the Contemptor as a standard Dreadnought. The box set costs a lot at £195 or $315, but at least on paper in theory land, it's one of the very cheapest ways that you could build an entire functioning Space Marine army. And there's plenty of other scope for Heresy era models that could very much be applied to the 40k era setting. You might just run into trouble for certain miniatures out there where there's just no good alternative in the Heresy, or a bunch of Heresy things that might not be applicable to 40k. Definitely a bit more of a weird and creative way to do a Space Marine army, but again, at least in theory, you might actually wind up with a collection that you could use in 2 different gaming systems, playing Heresy era or 40k games if you wanted. Otherwise, before we move on to options to expand, I just wanted to mention upgrade sprues as well. These can be popular to get some sculpted details for, say, some shoulder pads for certain chapters. I would see them as a bit of a luxury buy though, given that Games Workshop charge quite a lot for what they are, I think. Though other ones like the Black Templar one, I'd say, aren't quite as bad a deal for what you get. As other options for some sculpted chapter iconography, the Forge World Heresy range also has options for aesthetics as well, though that's going to cost even more given its Forge World resin. And as mentioned, there are quite a lot of cool bits from 3D printing creators out there. I know Great Eye Studio is one interesting example that makes some custom bits that fit well with 40k, particularly for things like Blood Angels and Space Wolves. But there's lots of other creators out there, either providing STL files or 3D printed bits that can be shipped to your door. In general, between all that, I'd probably start with 1 or 2 of the discount offerings out there, get that painted up as the core of your army, and then gradually build out the force unit by unit from there, adding in units that are either exciting to use in game or fit well with the lore of what you're trying to achieve for your army. Again, focusing on maybe newer player picks, one interesting metric for expanding armies in 40k are the amount of points that you get on the board for the amount of money that you spent, and Space Marines do have some things that are significantly better for that than others. Perhaps 3 of them are the Hellblasters, the Terminators, and Rabute Gilliman himself if you're going down an Ultramarines route. Compared with most of the Space Marine range, all of these get you more points on the board for the money that you spent than virtually anything else. In particular, I feel like the Hellblasters are a pretty ideal new player unit. Fun exciting plasma guns, lots of points on the board for the money, and also just kind of easy to use in game. Nice general purpose firepower that will make a nasty mess of enemy elite infantry, can chip in against tanks, and are sort of forgiving enough to use as they get to fire in death, so you get a bit of a reward for having them shot down. The Terminators maybe aren't quite so hot in game in terms of play on the competitive tables right now, though I'd say they're usable enough in the right army. Plus the models for 10th edition are quite fun ones in my opinion, so it could be a pretty reasonable choice to add more of, particularly if you wound up getting the Leviathan box or the Terminator Librarian, so at least you've got all your Terminator characters to be able to have a retinue if you want. Otherwise, for strong options in game at the moment, I recently made a video about 3 Space Marine units that just crop up in a ton of competitive lists, and these are those. Basically the units that can be relied on to help out win the objective game, while the rest of the army goes about doing what it does. Space Marine Scouts are the cheapest units that can scrap for the midfield and be more expendable than most Space Marine units, and that has a good value all of its own. It's quite nice to have cheap units sat up the board to be able to do secondary objectives early on as well. Jump Intercessors are just currently all around strong, a nice cheap unit that can bound down from the skies to do secondary objectives once more, and are quite nice at bullying sort of medium enemy infantry units, as they've got a fairly impressive amount of damage for how fast and cheap they are. And finally, Space Marine Infiltrators are a really good one for being a flexible, sneaky unit, usually fielded in units of 5. To use their deep strike denial rule to stop anyone going near your home objective, though if the enemy aren't using reserves they can contribute to holding down the midfield, maybe alongside some scouts. Otherwise for Space Marines, when expanding the army, I'd say perhaps one of the most important things to be able to have an answer to like enemy tanks, vehicles and monsters, and I feel like things that can take down heavy targets are quite a good thing to prioritise early on. I feel like with at least a fair few of the Space Marine discount and value box sets, you might have a few too many basic guys with bolters, and not quite enough things that are going to be able to destroy the biggest and best things that the enemy has. For some examples of these, the Gladiator Lancer is a pretty great dedicated solution to just busting enemy armour. Seriously massive threat with that laser destroyer with its inbuilt rerolls. The Redemptor Dreadnought is just a good solid powerhouse unit to march up the board, laughing off a bunch of damage with -1 damage and a 2+ save that you can use Armour of Contempt on, plus fairly nice melee as well. And maybe for a more dedicated anti-tank solution, Eradicators can do really well. Melter weapons with nasty inbuilt rerolls. On paper, they're one of the most impressive anti-tank choices that the Space Marines can have, though the question is how they're going to get to their targets. You might need a detachment that can either advance and shoot like maybe Gladius or Firestorm, or think about a transport for them like maybe a Repulsor. As I mentioned earlier, when expanding an army, I'd probably be a little bit wary of going too heavy into Firstborn Space Marines, or if you do decide to pick a bunch of them up, just know what you're getting into and what Games Workshop are likely to do in the future. In 10th edition, Games Workshop sent a large amount of previous Firstborn Space Marine units to Legends, basically meaning they're still playable in casual play, but not recommended for tournaments and won't receive future balance updates, kind of mothballed for the future as they gradually get forgotten about. Generally seen as a pretty bad thing for people who own the models and have them as a big section of their army. Given the trends, I'd say that 11th edition is likely to have this happen in another big way. It's expected within 2 years' time by Games Workshop's normal calendar, and at that point I suspect there'll be another big Space Marine release wave to update a bunch of the last things that are Firstborn, and most everything else that doesn't get an update will be sent to Legends at that point. As a result, I'd just be kind of wary about going too heavy against anything that came out pre-Primaris. Obviously we don't know the entire details of exactly what they'll do with them yet, but basically I just wouldn't go buying an entire army that's mainly Firstborn Space Marines and then being surprised when Games Workshop sends them to Legends as they've been doing with the other ones. In any case though, there's certainly a massive amount of ways that you can build and expand a Space Marine army, and often the general internet advice tends to be just have a lot of scope for just collecting what you like the look of, or the things that you like the feel of. 40k rules do change over time, and as mentioned earlier, just having such a big range means that you're probably not going to have the absolute most optimal Space Marine army out there, and chasing the meta might not be worth the time and money. I still likely focus on getting some mainline damage dealers as well, either big guns that bust armour or mass damage to scary melee close combat units, and just have a balance of that and different battlefield roles, and not just acquire lots and lots of different flavours of guys with bolters, which might not have much effectiveness on the tabletop if that's what you're going for. Currently in Codex Space Marines, as mentioned, the overall power of the core faction is a little bit weak right now, though I probably wouldn't expect that to remain the same way, but within the Codex there's actually a fair amount of internal balance. I feel like the vast majority of their units can be made to work in the right list, even if you do see some things on the table a lot more in competitive lists versus others. As mentioned, all those objective scorers are pretty great: infiltrators, scouts, jump intercessors, and maybe inceptors. Hard to go wrong with things that are going to score you points. Those big anti-tank gun units that I mentioned are quite nice, though the majority of big gun tanks can do really well, things like the Repulsor Executioner or the Vindicator. Most of the elite infantry can do nicely in the right detachment, as well as Hellblasters and Eradicators, which I mentioned. Having an aggressor squad supported by a character and delivered by a Land Raider is often quite a good combo. You can do nasty things in both Gladius and Firestorm Assault Force with that. And for character units, I feel like they kind of need to be applied to the right sort of squads. Lieutenants are generally hard to go too far wrong with, giving their unit a flat damage boost, particularly against tough stuff. And Tech Marines are nice enough if they've got good vehicles to support, particularly Space Marine vehicles that hit on a 3+ without inbuilt rerolls. The transport options, like the Impulsors and Repulsors, are fine enough, generally for one big combo unit as opposed to spamming them across an entire army. And perhaps for unique special characters, Marnius Calgar and Uriel Ventris out of the Ultramarines tend to be pretty standout value. I quite like both Vulcan Hestan and Adrax Agaton for the Salamanders, and Kavan Shrike of the Raven Guard's really nice. Some scary lone operative on a big unit of jump packs. If you're looking for Imperial agents and allies, maybe the single most commonly played one is the Calidus Assassin. Her ability is to use her stealth to jump on and off the board, which can be nice for doing actions and scoring points in Pariah Nexus missions currently. Talking of current Space Marine rules, let's briefly mention the Codex and a few of the detachments that you can field. The current Space Marine rulebook is £37, €47.50 or $60 from Games Workshop, obviously a bit less with the discount retailers. It's a fairly beefy book given how many Space Marine units there are, and using the Codex code in that allows you to unlock the rules content for the faction out of the Warhammer app. As mentioned though, places like Warpedia or New Recruit can be good ways to see rules from unofficial third-party sources, and can be good things to use to make army lists if you don't have the subscription to Warhammer Plus for the Games Workshop Battleforge thing. A fair few people quite like datasheet cards that come out for the factions. The Space Marine ones were £25, €32 or $40, though you'd likely have to try and find them second hand now, given that Games Workshop often just make these and then go out of stock of them after the Codex has been released, but they can be alright for some handy flashcards to see unit profiles and things in game. If you can find some handily though, definitely not a mandatory purchase. As mentioned, if you want to go for a Divergent Space Marine chapter, so one of the ones with a whole bunch of their unique characters and units and things like Dark Angels, Space Wolves and Blood Angels and friends, they all have their own indexes and codexes. Currently Dark Angels is the only one that's got its codex released at time of recording. Blood Angels will be soon, and Space Wolves and Black Templars should be later in the edition. It does mean that rules access for those is essentially a little bit more expensive due to having to pick up 2 books. Deathwatch does things really quite differently in 10th edition, it seems, basically being rolled into the Imperial Agents Codex, and has the weird choice between either fighting as an allied detachment to a standard Space Marine force, or if you field the bespoke Deathwatch detachment, you only get access to literally their unique units and nothing else, so are in a bit of an awkward place in 10th edition compared with previously. Otherwise, current points for the faction are found in the Minotaur and Field Manual in the Warhammer 40k download section of Warhammer Community. And you can also find the rules there for playing with the Combat Patrol versions of the rules and Legends rules for any of the other Space Marine datasheets that have been sent there. Still very usable for casual games, but some players like them far more than others. For actual rules content, as mentioned, the Space Marine gameplay varies really quite a lot from army to army and detachment to detachment. For the most part though, they just tend to be or at least fairly elite forces without too many Horde style options. Usually resistant to small arms with a good 3+ armour save there, and they can all handle themselves in combat against, say, standard Horde style foes, say Tyranid Termagants or Imperial Guardsmen. The core rule for the army is Oath of Moment. Basically you nominate one unit in the enemy army in your command phase, and your entire force will be able to reroll hit rolls against that target until your next command phase. Generally it tends to make sense to use that on the biggest, scariest enemy threat around if you're going to be dumping loads of damage into it, but depending on the battlefield situation it might make more sense to give you the best chance in one important positional fight somewhere around the map, or use it on a big important combat where you absolutely can't afford for your scary melee units to do badly. Then beyond that, we've got the Divergent chapter rules, 6 that are kind of loosely themed around the various different chapters, though of course you can use any detachment for any chapter. And then the First Company Task Force, which is all about Terminators and Veteran units, so 7 detachments in total, plus the few that the Divergent chapters can access. I've made an entire video for the different detachments that Space Marines can field. I'll link that down in the video description, though I'll give a very quick overview of each of them. The Gladius is kind of the Ultramarines themed one, all about tactical balance with combat doctrines that allow you some move and damage type options. There's a nice melee stratagem for Lance melee with extra AP in the Assault doctrine, and one important combo is the Fire Discipline enhancement. Give that to a Lieutenant or an Apothecary Biologist and a Shooter unit, and you can have some Aggressors or Hellblasters deal out a crazy amount of damage. It's generally considered one of the stronger ones. The Stormlance Task Force is the White Scar themed one. It gives your entire army advance and charge and fall back and charge, so very much helpful for melee units, and then most of the stratagems support bikers. There's a 1 command point, one for -1 to hit and wound at range, and an enhancement to allow units to arrive first turn from reserves, which can be kind of scary with rapid ingress. This one doesn't really tend to work quite so well for standard Space Marines due to Outriders not really being good enough to carry the general damage of an army. It's absolutely savage with Space Wolf Thunderwolves though, which can use all of the mounted stratagems. The Firestorm Assault Force is the Salamanders one, and this one ties in well with their close range shooting things. The assault keywords to get things in range, and then +1 strength on ranged weapons within 12 inches, very nice for Melter and Flamers. They've got a whole bunch of transport stratagems here as well, so it can be nice for things like Eradicators jumping out of repulsors. At a nice general purpose, +1 to wound the closest target with Crucible of Battle. Very good for elite infantry dealing damage there. I'm going to say it's one of the stronger ones, though typically not quite as strong as maybe Gladius or Vanguard have tended to be. Anvil Siege Force is the one themed around Imperial Fists. The core rule is Shield of the Imperium, giving all ranged weapons the heavy keyword for a +1 to wound if they're static, and you also get a +1 to wound if any heavy weapons already had that keyword, so it can make things like, say, Hellblaster plasma guns or heavy intercessor bolt rifles extra punchy. They've got a few fun stratagems, including one to punish enemy monsters and vehicles, and a combo that they can do with a 5+ sustained and lethal hits with a lieutenant. Maybe a formation that tends to work a bit better in more casual games that don't put much terrain on the table. In more common competitive matches, though, this one isn't considered very strong. In 40k, units just can't really tend to just be sat around shooting most of the time. They usually need to be moving and shooting to get towards objectives or lines of sight. The first company task force is the Veterans and Terminator style one. Their core rule giving you a big turn of boosted oath a moment with rerolls to hit and to wound against one target. It does mean that that'll be some exceptional damage there, but only applying to one unit for one turn is a bit rough for a detachment rule. Their stratagems are all locked to the Veterans or Terminator units. A last one is return Terminators to reserve, and there's a feel no pain type enhancement for a turn of Terminators being really quite tanky, plus a nice simple +1 to hit for Veterans units one. I feel like this one has generally been a bit hampered by the strength of the datasheets. Most of the veteran style units have been merely okay in 10th edition so far, and generally this one doesn't really seem to get played in competitive play. The Vanguard Spearhead is the Raven Guard sort of sneaky Space Marine type army. The core rule Shadow Masters allows them to blend into the background for a cover and a -1 to hit when they're greater than 12 inches away. Really quite nice against ranged armies out there. Otherwise they've got a scary enhancement called Blade Driven Deep, which means a character can give it infiltrates to any unit that they're leading. Can be nice with something scary like a big unit of aggressors or terminators. And there's a 1 command point Guerrilla Tactics one that can return things to reserve. Can be scary with things like the combo with Centurions and Uriel Ventress. You can have some scary firepower warping around the board. In general, this one's tended to be one of the more competitive Space Marine detachments, particularly for the Ultramarines with Calgar and Ventress. Finally, we've got the Ironstorm Spearhead, the Space Marine force that's themed around Iron Hands and meant to support big tanks and dreadnoughts. Armoured Wrath is the core rule, giving you a single reroll either to hit, wound or damage per unit whenever attacking, so just extra damage whether you're shooting or fighting every turn. It's good on big high power anti-tank shots where you get the most value from it. Otherwise the stratagems all support vehicles in various different ways, and they've got a strong enhancement that allows you to make a failed save become damage 0, really quite big guaranteed extra life on your vehicles from a tech marine there. And basically if you've got an entire army of vehicles and dreadnoughts, this one will generally power it up a fair bit. Again, I'd say it's one of the strongest Space Marine detachments out there, though it took some heavy nerfs in the last update, perhaps pushing it down a bit more to merely usable rather than stand out strong. In any case, between those 7, there's really quite a lot of different ways that you could play Space Marines, and I do quite like the way that a lot of the detachments can have some interesting stuff for a number of units, rather than being very aggressively linked to certain unit keywords like some codexes out there. Finally, to finish up, here's just one example of a somewhat balanced Space Marine army list. This one's a Gladius Task Force one that was used by a Pontus Cock to take first at a 30-player tournament, and I feel like it's really quite a good example of what works well with Space Marines, and also does use a fair variety of different units as well. This one's an Ultramarines Gladius Task Force, so it's headed up by Marnius Calgar himself. I believe he said that he ran with the Company Heroes for an interesting brawler and fairly tough midfield unit. And then there's a big unit of assault intercessors that will be hiding in the Land Raider with Uriel Ventress, a good midfield brawler unit with reroll wound rolls on the midfield objectives. Uriel Ventress can give his deep strike ability to the big squad of Hellblasters that are to be accompanied with a lieutenant with fire discipline. That essentially means that they can warp in onto the board, get line of sight on something important, and activate that entire fire discipline combo, getting a sustained and lethal hits on a 5+, and lightly re-rolling everything that isn't a 5+ with Oath of Moment. That combo can absolutely flatten most enemy units that it sets its targets on. Then beyond that, there's 3 units of jump intercessors with power fists and plasma pistols. As mentioned, really good efficient secondary support that can scrap well with enemy lighter units. A unit of infiltrators that could screen out the home field objective by denying deep strike with their Omni Scramblers. A unit of incursors, which interestingly enough apparently go in the Impulsor in this list. Between their shots and the Sky Talon array and their scout move, you've got a little tank that's quite cheap and spits out a quite impressive amount of strength 4 shooting, and the incursors could potentially be used to mark targets for a +1 to hit after they get out. There's a cheap and expendable unit of scouts with a heavy bolter to secure objectives in the midboard, rarely ever a bad idea. And then to back it all up with a bit of dedicated anti-tank, there's 2 scary gladiator lancers with their big inbuilt rerolls. Enemy heavies just really can't relax when they're around. And the Land Raider that transports the Assault Intercessors and Ventress is a Land Raider Redeemer, enormously scary Overwatch with those Flamestorm cannons, and a really big tough threat to take down in its own right, with Armour of Contempt being an option. Overall, I feel like it's really quite a good example of what Space Marines can do right now, using really quite a lot of different units, both range and melee damage dealers, plus some sneaky stuff to grab objectives. I feel like it's got a good feel to it. In any case though, I'll leave this one there. Hopefully that's been a bit of inspiration for people starting to collect a Space Marine army out there in Warhammer 40k right now. As always, look forward to taking a look at your comments and any other hints and tips that you might have for newer players out there. As mentioned, I'll leave a couple of videos links down in the video description, my Space Marine tier list video, where I talk through each of the units in the Codex, plus the which detachment to choose video. Hopefully they could be helpful if you are wanting a bit more Space Marine content to watch. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly have more coming for the Space Marines in due course. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos or you found this one useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep more like this coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the links are down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.